Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a fascinating little accident in history. The kind of story where you wouldn't expect something world-changing to come out of it. You're going to hear about the accidental invention of the very first windmill. An innovation that started as an experiment, but ended up powering entire civilizations. Imagine a time when harnessing the wind wasn't about sleek turbines, but clunky, often frustrating prototypes. It's a tale of ingenuity, necessity, and that weird moment when things unexpectedly click. You probably won't survive this journey without a bit of confusion at some points. Because, honestly, even the smartest people of the time had no clue what was going on with wind power. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're still here, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to start with a simple question. Why did people start looking to the wind for help in the first place? If you think about it, wind has always been a pretty powerful force. But ancient civilizations didn't exactly have sleek science labs to harness its power. No. The need for wind power arose out of the basics: food, water, and survival. You see, early humans were just trying to make life easier. There were crops to grind, water to pump, and materials to process. People were desperately looking for a way to get things done more efficiently. It's like modern-day us, trying to avoid washing dishes by hand. You're always searching for the next convenient gadget, even if it's as simple as a microwave. But back then, the need for convenience was serious. Life was tougher. And so, people started wondering, could wind be the answer? Historians still argue whether the windmill idea was born purely out of necessity, or if there was a little bit of curiosity involved, too. But one thing's for sure. Those early structures were far from what we'd think of as a windmill today. Instead of a nice, efficient rotating blade, early attempts at harnessing the wind were rough, makeshift, and even a little dangerous. Yet they set the groundwork for something much bigger. And here's the thing. We often think of ancient civilizations as having everything figured out. But the truth is, they were still experimenting, like we do today. What they came up with, by accident, would eventually transform entire industries. But first, let's dive into some of the first crude structures that people built to catch the wind. They weren't windmills in the classic sense. They were more like sails. And trust me, this is where things get interesting. Now that we've set the stage with the need for wind power, let's dive into some of the first structures designed to harness that wind. If you imagine the early days of wind-catching devices, think of large, awkward sails strung up on poles. These were the earliest forms of wind-powered machines. Not nearly as elegant or effective as the windmills we're familiar with today. But they marked the start of something huge. Ancient civilizations, particularly the Persians, were the first to really experiment with these wind-catching structures, long before anyone thought to make a proper windmill. You might be surprised to learn that the very first windmills weren't even in Europe. They were in ancient Persia, around the 9th century. These early windmills were vertical axis designs, which is a little different from the ones we usually think of today, which are horizontal axis. The idea was simple enough. They were essentially large, rotating sails connected to a vertical shaft that caught the wind and could turn it into power. But here's the kicker. At this stage, people were using them primarily to pump water. Yes, water. Before grinding grain or generating electricity, windmills were about making sure you could irrigate your crops or get fresh water out of a well. Historians still argue whether these vertical axis windmills were the first true windmills, or if there were earlier, less documented examples. But what we do know is that these early inventions were far from perfect. They were loud, clunky, and didn't really catch the wind in the most efficient way. But despite these flaws, they worked, sort of. And that was enough to spark further experimentation. Over time, these structures evolved from rudimentary sails to more sophisticated systems that could power not just water pumps, but also grain mills. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These Persian windmills weren't even in their final form yet. The structure wasn't quite what we think of as a windmill. And the people using them didn't quite realize how revolutionary the idea was at the time. They were more focused on survival and basic agricultural needs. But in hindsight, it's easy to see how these simple machines would have had a profound effect on the way people lived and worked. Interestingly enough, as the technology started to spread through the Middle East, it didn't immediately make its way to Europe. Instead, the windmill's true evolution took place when it landed on European shores, where the windmill would slowly be refined into a tool capable of transforming entire economies. As we continue, though, remember that while these early wind-catching sails were important steps, they weren't the stars of the show just yet. The true magic of windmills came a little later, after a few more trial and error attempts and, believe it or not, an accident or two. But we'll get to that soon. For now, it's worth appreciating that these ancient wind structures, primitive as they were the first to try to make use of wind in any real capacity. All right, now we've got the basics down about those early, rudimentary wind-catching structures. But let's dig a little deeper into the story of how windmills made their way from Persia to the wider world, specifically to Europe, where they would undergo a fascinating transformation. When these early vertical axis windmills were first built in Persia, they didn't exactly come with instructions on how to make them more efficient or how to make them useful for large-scale farming. No, that would take time. A lot of trial and error. And, of course, the introduction of new materials and designs. Still, there was something about the idea that stuck. So, while they were initially used to pump water and occasionally grind grain, the concept gradually spread westward into Europe over several centuries. And this is where things get interesting. Historians still argue whether the Persians were the first to invent the windmill, or if there were earlier, perhaps forgotten prototypes elsewhere in the ancient world. The Egyptians, for example, were known to use simple sails on their boats to catch the wind. But what is undeniable is that the Persian windmills were the first to show serious utility in the form of a mechanical structure that harnessed wind power on land, which became the model for everything that came after. Fast forward to the 11th century. The technology had spread to Europe, mainly through the Crusaders, who brought back ideas and inventions from the Middle East. The introduction of windmills to Europe had a profound impact. But they didn't immediately resemble what we know today. In fact, the windmills that made it to Europe were still vertical axis designs, which had been the standard in Persia. But as the need for more efficient energy grew, European engineers began to improve upon these designs. Here's where the magic happens. As these windmills made their way through Europe, they started evolving. It wasn't a huge leap, but a series of small, almost accidental improvements. One of the first big innovations was the switch to horizontal axis windmills, which had blades that rotated on a horizontal axis, making them much more efficient at catching the wind. But this shift wasn't immediate. It took a few decades, and no one really set out to create the perfect windmill design. Instead, these modifications came from observing the wind's behavior and tweaking existing structures. The Dutch were particularly important in these changes by the 13th century. They had made windmills much more efficient, using them not only for grinding grain, but also for draining water from low-lying areas, which was crucial to their agricultural land. So, in a sense, the windmill started becoming less of an accidental invention and more of a crafted, purposeful tool. And here's a quirky tidbit. The earliest European windmills had some pretty unusual shapes and sizes. Some were round, some were square, and others were more like large, upright barrels with blades attached. They were far from the sleek, streamlined models we picture today, but they were groundbreaking for their time. Historians still argue whether the Dutch perfected the design, or if there were other countries that made significant contributions along the way. But one thing is clear. Once the windmill took root in Europe, its evolution picked up pace rapidly. And so, the idea that started as an accident, simple structures trying to catch wind for irrigation or basic milling, transformed over time into a major force that powered entire regions, economies, and even the future of renewable energy. But we're still not quite at the windmill as we know it today stage. The first windmills were useful, sure, but they were also deeply imperfect. Grinding grain took time, and wind speeds were unpredictable. So, how did we get from there to the modern marvels we see in fields today? That's what we'll explore in the next section. But for now, it's fascinating to think about how one simple idea, catching the wind, would go on to shape the world in ways no one could have predicted. Now that we've covered the early evolution of windmills in Persia and their arrival in Europe, let's take a closer look at the moment when the windmill truly began to take on a symbolic and functional importance. This is where the story shifts from trial and error to something approaching mastery, as windmills evolved from awkward prototypes to critical technological assets in European economies. One of the first things to note is the connection between windmills and the growth of agricultural economies, particularly in the Netherlands. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Dutch had perfected the art of windmill design, and the windmill became a quintessential part of their landscape. Windmills weren't just tools for grinding grain anymore. They were used for draining water from the land, pumping water for irrigation, and even powering sawmills to cut timber. Essentially, the windmill helped turn an entire country of marshy, reclaimed land into a bustling agricultural hub, and, in doing so, it gave rise to an entirely new way of farming and managing land. The Dutch understood that a windmill could be a pretty big deal if you could harness its power properly, and they began to build large networks of windmills along dikes and waterways to pump water out of areas that would otherwise be flooded. Some historians argue that the Netherlands' mastery of windmill technology was as important to the country's success as their strategic location and strong trade networks. After all, without a steady supply of dry land to farm on, their economy would have struggled to thrive. So, the windmill became not just a tool of convenience, but an integral part of a booming agricultural economy. Interestingly, the Netherlands' success with windmills led to a unique phenomenon: windmill cities. These were places where entire towns and regions depended on windmills for daily operations. And they were built specifically around the idea of utilizing wind power. These towns didn't just rely on windmills for milling grain. They used them for everything from pumping water to powering industries like paper making and textiles. The Dutch weren't the only ones to harness the wind in this way, but they were certainly the most successful at turning it into a widespread system that formed the backbone of their agricultural prosperity. Historians still argue whether the rise of windmills directly caused the Netherlands' golden age or if it was merely a side effect of other factors like trade, politics, and military strategy. However, it's difficult to deny that windmills played an essential role in the success of the Dutch economy during the 16th and 17th centuries. Without these machines, it's safe to say that the region would not have been able to support the population, let alone produce the goods that would fuel their economic dominance. But the Dutch weren't alone in appreciating the power of windmills. As the technology spread across Europe, other countries began to see the practical value in harnessing wind power. In England, for example, windmills were used extensively for grinding grain, and by the 17th century, they were critical to the nation's agricultural output. Even in countries like Spain and Italy, windmills became a key feature of rural life, used for a variety of tasks ranging from irrigation to sawing timber. The widespread use of windmills across Europe by this time shows just how far the technology had come from its humble origins. And it's interesting to think that the very tool that had started as a crude, accidental invention had morphed into one of the most important innovations in agricultural history. These early windmills, no longer just odd sails tied to poles, had become well-oiled machines capable of performing multiple tasks that, without them, would have been much harder to complete. But even as the windmill began to change the agricultural landscape, its impact wasn't yet fully understood. It wasn't until much later, when these structures began to decline in the face of new technologies, that people truly started to appreciate how much windmills had contributed to society. As we continue, we'll explore the strange and accidental improvements that happened along the way. Things that weren't planned, but ended up making the windmill more effective and efficient, because even the most important inventions often emerge from a mix of intent and accident. It's funny how that works, isn't it? Now that we've explored the rise of windmills in the Netherlands and their influence on agriculture, let's take a moment to focus on something that many people overlook in the history of windmills, the happy accidents that made them even better. This is where the history of windmills gets a little quirky. You see, while the Dutch were busy building elaborate networks of windmills to drain their land and grind grain, there were still a lot of unintended improvements happening along the way. Windmill technology didn't just improve by careful design, it also advanced by sheer trial and error. In the early days of windmill construction, the primary goal was simple: catch the wind and make it do something useful. But as people continued experimenting with windmill designs, they started to notice certain patterns, such as which blade shapes worked best in different wind conditions. Sometimes, it was a simple twist of fate, like when a windmill's blades were accidentally tilted at an angle that worked better than expected. Other times, a new material might be tried, like wood or stone, and it was discovered that one type of wood held up better against the harsh winds than another. These kinds of accidental improvements weren't always planned. In fact, sometimes the designs were downright clumsy. Early European windmills often had blades that were too heavy or too short, making them inefficient at catching the wind. But little by little, improvements were made. For example, The Dutch realized that by adding a tail or rudder to a windmill's blades, they could allow the mill to turn automatically to face the wind. This was a game changer because it meant that the windmill no longer needed constant adjustment to remain effective. The addition of a tail was a small but significant improvement that took the windmill from a cumbersome manual task to a semi-autonomous system. Historians still debate whether these improvements were truly accidental, or if the inventors at the time were working with an instinctual sense of engineering. Some scholars argue that there was a great deal of thought and planning behind the developments, while others contend that these changes were often born out of necessity or failure. But regardless of how it happened, what matters is that these small adjustments transformed the windmill from a simple machine into a highly efficient tool that could serve a variety of purposes. Take, for instance, the addition of sails to windmill blades. Originally, windmills used flat blades, but it wasn't long before someone thought to add fabric sails, much like those found on a sailing boat, which allowed the blades to catch more wind. The result was a much more efficient windmill, capable of generating more power. And then there's the introduction of the smock mill, a type of windmill with a rotating cap that could be turned to face the wind. This was another brilliant improvement that allowed windmills to work in a wider range of conditions. Even something as seemingly simple as the addition of shutters to control the amount of wind hitting the blades helped maximize efficiency. By the time windmills reached their peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were incredibly efficient machines. But it wasn't just the addition of new features that made them so effective. It was also the gradual optimization of the materials used. For example, over time, the Dutch began using metal components to reinforce the wooden structure of the windmill, making them more durable and capable of withstanding harsh conditions. This gradual shift in materials helped the windmill become more reliable and long-lasting, allowing it to remain in use for centuries. But here's the funny part. Despite all these improvements, windmills were still far from perfect. As efficient as they had become, they still relied on the wind, which, as we all know, can be unpredictable. Sometimes there wasn't enough wind to power the mill, and sometimes there was too much, causing the mill to break or overheat. And then, of course, there was the issue of wear and tear. As windmills continued to be used for centuries, they often required regular repairs and maintenance. It's a little like how, no matter how good your phone is, it still needs a software update every now and then. In the next section, we'll dive into the windmill's role in shaping society even further. Specifically, its influence on the economies of Europe and how these machines played a critical role in the development of entire regions. But for now, it's fun to think about how the windmill was both an invention and an accidental masterpiece, honed over time by the people who used it and, of course, by the wind itself. Now that we've seen how the windmill became an increasingly efficient tool through a mix of trial, error, and accidental improvements, it's time to focus on the broader picture, how these machines impacted the economies of Europe and how, in turn, shaped entire regions. Windmills weren't just technological wonders. They became vital to the functioning of entire societies, allowing industries to flourish and economies to grow. It's hard to overstate just how integral windmills were to Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods. By the 16th century, windmills had spread throughout much of Europe, and with them came an economic revolution. We tend to think of these machines as simple grain grinders or water pumps, but they were much more than that. They became the backbone of entire industries. In fact, the rise of windmills coincided with a period of significant growth in European agriculture and industry. The Dutch, in particular, became renowned for their windmill prowess, using them not only for agriculture but for a range of industrial purposes. They used windmills to drain land, grind grain, saw timber, and even process spices and oil. Without the windmill, it's hard to imagine how such an agricultural and industrial boom could have happened. Historians still debate the exact role that windmills played in Europe's economic growth. Some argue that windmills were merely one part of a larger series of technological, agricultural, and political changes that helped Europe thrive. Others suggest that windmills were the catalyst for these changes, enabling economies to expand at a rapid rate. One thing is for sure, though, windmills were crucial in creating a surplus of food and resources that allowed Europe to grow. Let's take a look at the Netherlands again, where windmills were so central to the economy. The Dutch used windmills to drain large areas of swampy land, making it suitable for farming and building settlements. The country became a master of land reclamation, and that land was incredibly valuable. Windmills, therefore, allowed the Dutch to not only grow more food, but also develop a thriving market for agricultural products. But windmills weren't limited to agriculture. They were also used in various manufacturing processes, from textile production to paper making. Wind-powered sawmills, for instance, enabled the Dutch to process timber at an unprecedented rate, boosting the shipbuilding industry. But the windmill's impact wasn't just about more food or more efficient industries. It also helped create a shift in social and economic structures. The availability of wind-powered mills made it easier for smaller farmers to process grain and other products, which meant they could participate in larger trade networks. This allowed for the rise of the merchant class, a group that would go on to shape Europe's future. With the ability to produce surplus goods and transport them efficiently, merchants began to play a much more significant role in Europe's growing economy. The windmill, in many ways, helped lay the foundation for modern capitalism. As we look at the broader scope, it's clear that the windmill's impact was multifaceted. It wasn't just about helping people survive. It was about changing the way people lived, worked, and interacted with their environment. The windmill helped shape entire economies, and in doing so, it changed the course of history. Of course, there were other forces at play as well. But without the windmill's ability to harness natural power, Europe's agricultural and industrial revolutions would have looked very different. What's perhaps most fascinating about this period is that the windmill, which started as an accidental invention, became so crucial to society. It began as a tool to help people manage the most basic needs: food, water, shelter, and ended up being one of the driving forces behind Europe's economic growth. The windmill's journey from a simple water pump to a symbol of European industrialization shows just how much an accident can shape the future. In the next section, we'll explore how windmills continued to evolve over time, especially in relation to the rise of other industries. As we'll see, the windmill's impact didn't end with agriculture. It also laid the groundwork for the development of modern industry, with consequences that are still being felt today. But for now, it's worth pausing to appreciate how the humble windmill helped to transform Europe's entire economic landscape. As we've seen, windmills played a huge role in transforming European agriculture and industry, making the old world more efficient and prosperous. But windmills were far from static in their development. As industries grew and technology progressed, the windmill itself evolved, too. What began as a crude tool for simple tasks like pumping water and grinding grain began to develop into something much more complex. Something that would eventually power large industries. But to understand the full impact of windmills on the growth of European industry, we need to take a closer look at how they were adapted and improved over time. One of the most interesting developments was the introduction of windmills into industries beyond agriculture, as European economies began to shift toward manufacturing. Windmills played a key role in this transition. By the 16th and 17th centuries, windmills were being used to power sawmills, paper mills, and even textile mills. The Dutch, ever the pioneers, were at the forefront of these innovations. By harnessing the wind, they were able to run entire factories without relying on human or animal power. This was a game changer for industries that required significant amounts of energy to operate. The rise of wind-powered factories marked a major turning point in the Industrial Revolution. With the ability to use wind as a renewable source of energy, European industries were able to scale up production without being constrained by the need for fuel or other resources. This helped fuel an unprecedented period of economic growth. The shift from hand-powered production to wind-powered production created new opportunities for trade, labor, and commerce. It also laid the groundwork for future technological innovations, including the eventual rise of steam power in the 19th century. Historians still debate whether the windmill was truly a precursor to the steam engine. But it's clear that wind-powered industries played a pivotal role in shifting Europe toward more modern modes of production. The ability to harness natural energy in this way allowed industries to thrive in areas where resources like coal or water power were scarce. In some cases, windmills were even used to power machines in places as diverse as mining operations and grain mills. For a period, the windmill became one of the most versatile sources of energy available. But the windmill wasn't perfect. There were still a number of limitations. Wind, as you might expect, can be pretty fickle. There were times when the wind just wouldn't blow, and windmills had to sit idle. And even when the wind did blow, it wasn't always at the right speed or in the right direction. It's not hard to imagine that some poor miller would spend an entire day waiting for the wind to cooperate. There were also other mechanical issues, like wear and tear. That meant windmills needed constant upkeep. And then there was the fact that windmills didn't always make things easier. Sure, they could power an entire factory or irrigate a field, but they required a level of skill to operate and maintain that not everyone had. In a way, the windmill's dependence on natural forces made it both a blessing and a curse. It was a wonderful source of power when the conditions were right, but it was also a bit of a gamble when the wind wasn't cooperating. Despite these drawbacks, the windmill's impact on industry was undeniable. As Europe entered the 18th century, windmills began to decline in favor of steam engines and other forms of power. But it wasn't the end for windmills. Far from it. Windmills continued to evolve, with the development of wind-powered water pumps and wind turbines, which eventually became the foundation of the modern renewable energy movement. Today, we look at the legacy of the windmill with a sense of awe. What started as an accidental invention in Persia has, in many ways, come full circle. Modern wind turbines are now used to generate clean energy, harnessing the same natural forces that powered the windmills of old. So, while windmills may have fallen out of favor in many industries, their impact on the way we think about energy and sustainability is still felt today. In the next section, we'll explore the windmill's role in the rise of water management, which was just as crucial to human civilization as its role in agriculture and industry. The ability to control water, especially in flood-prone areas, was a major factor in shaping entire regions and ensuring the survival of populations. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to appreciate just how far the windmill's journey has taken us. Starting as a simple tool and evolving into a technological marvel that changed the face of entire economies. As we move forward, it's time to delve into one of the most crucial aspects of the windmill's evolution, its role in water management. While we tend to associate windmills with grain milling or industrial power, their use for water control is arguably one of the most transformative contributions they made to society. Water is life, of course. But it's also a destructive force. In regions like the Netherlands, which are prone to flooding, the ability to control water levels was not just a convenience, it was a matter of survival. And this is where the windmill truly shined. In the early days, the Dutch were particularly adept at using windmills to manage water. The country's low-lying geography made it incredibly susceptible to flooding, especially in areas where water from rivers and the sea would push into farmland and settlements. Over time, the Dutch perfected the art of using windmills to drain water from these flood-prone areas and pump it into canals or rivers. The windmill was used to power mechanical pumps that lifted water from low-lying land and moved it to higher ground, making previously uninhabitable marshes suitable for farming and living. Historians still argue whether the development of windmills for water management was as accidental as the first windmills themselves, or if it was a purposeful leap forward. But it's likely that this application arose from necessity. Early on, the Dutch recognized the importance of controlling water to preserve their farmland. The windmill was the perfect solution, providing a steady, renewable source of power for these water-pumping systems. Over time, a system of windmills was constructed along the dikes and canals to create a vast network of pumps, each one contributing to the draining of land and keeping floodwaters at bay. But the Dutch weren't alone in using windmills for water management. As the technology spread through Europe, other countries began to adopt similar techniques. Windmills were used to pump water in parts of France, Germany, and even Italy, with varying degrees of success. However, it was in the Netherlands where the windmill's role in water management truly reached its peak. By the 17th century, Dutch engineers had developed a highly sophisticated system of windmills that could drain entire regions. These mills, known as polder mills, were able to reclaim vast stretches of land from the sea, turning them into fertile farmland. The impact of these windmills on European society cannot be overstated. The ability to drain marshy land and create new farmland was one of the key reasons why the Dutch became such a dominant economic power in the 16th and 17th centuries. This newfound land allowed for increased agricultural production, which in turn supported a growing population and fueled the rise of trade. In fact, the Netherlands' success with windmill-powered water management played a major role in the country's golden age, when it became one of the wealthiest and most influential nations in Europe. The windmill's ability to control water also had a profound effect on the way that people viewed and interacted with the landscape. In a sense, windmills became symbols of human ingenuity and control over nature. The Dutch, for example, saw their windmill-powered water management system as a triumph over the forces of nature, an achievement that helped solidify their sense of national identity. It's fascinating to think that something as simple as a rotating set of blades could have such a profound impact on the way people shape their environment. However, as effective as windmills were at pumping water, they weren't without their challenges. The wind, as we know, is fickle. And sometimes, it simply didn't blow enough to power the mills efficiently. During periods of calm weather, the windmills would sit idle, and the water would begin to rise again. This meant that the Dutch had to be strategic in their placement of windmills, making sure they were positioned in areas where the wind would be most consistent. There was also the issue of maintenance. Windmills, like all machines, required constant upkeep, and it wasn't always easy to find skilled workers who could repair them. Despite these challenges, the windmill's role in water management remained central to the Netherlands' success. Even today, the country still uses windmills for water pumping. Though modern technology has replaced most of the traditional mills, the legacy of the windmill as a tool for water management is a reminder of just how innovative people can be when faced with the challenges of nature. And while the windmill may no longer be the primary means of controlling water in most parts of the world, its impact on European history is still felt today. In the next section, we'll explore the decline of the windmill as newer technologies began to take over. But before we do, it's worth reflecting on just how pivotal the windmill was in shaping the landscape of Europe and, in many ways, the course of history. From humble beginnings to a symbol of human ingenuity, the windmill helped make the world a more manageable place. As we've explored, windmills were revolutionary in shaping agriculture, industry, and even water management. But all good things come to an end, or at least evolve into something else. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as industrialization took hold in Europe, the windmill began its slow decline. New technologies like steam engines and later, electricity, offered far more consistent and powerful alternatives to wind power. The windmill, once the pride of European engineering, was gradually replaced by these newer, more reliable sources of energy. But was this really the end for the windmill, or simply the beginning of a new chapter? Historians still debate whether the windmill's decline was inevitable, or whether it was hastened by economic and social changes. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, marked the dawn of a new era in energy production. The advent of the steam engine provided a much more consistent and powerful form of energy, which could be used in factories, mills, and other industries. Steam engines didn't rely on the wind, which could be unpredictable and fickle. As a result, steam-powered machines became the backbone of industrialization, rendering the windmill somewhat obsolete. But the decline of the windmill wasn't immediate. In fact, windmills continued to be used in certain parts of Europe well into the 19th century, particularly in rural areas where other sources of power were scarce. Even in places like the Netherlands, windmills were still used to drain land and pump water. However, as more efficient machines came on the scene, windmills began to fall out of favor. They simply couldn't compete with the power and reliability of steam engines, which could run continuously and didn't need to rely on the wind. As windmills were replaced by steam engines, their role in society shifted. They became less of a practical tool and more of a relic of a bygone era. In many ways, the windmill's decline mirrored the larger shift in Europe's economy from agriculture and small-scale industry to large-scale factory production. The rise of steam power also meant that people could focus on industries that didn't rely on natural forces, such as textiles, coal mining, and manufacturing. But while the windmill's practical use diminished, its legacy didn't fade entirely. In fact, the windmill's decline laid the groundwork for what would later become the modern renewable energy movement. The idea of harnessing natural forces to generate power didn't disappear with the windmill. It simply took on a new form. In the 20th century, the development of wind turbines revitalized the concept of wind power. But this time it was done with modern technology and a deeper understanding of energy production. Wind turbines, which we see in fields and along coastlines today, are descendants of the windmills of old. The difference, of course, is that they are far more efficient. Thanks to advances in materials, aerodynamics, and engineering. But the core idea remains the same: harnessing the wind to produce energy. Wind power, which was once seen as a quaint relic of the past, is now considered one of the most promising sources of renewable energy for the future. It's interesting to think that the windmill's decline was not the end of its story. The windmill, in many ways, laid the foundation for the green energy revolution we are experiencing today. If not for the windmill, it's possible that wind turbines would never have been developed in the first place. And so, while the traditional windmill may no longer be as widespread as it once was, its impact on the way we think about energy and sustainability is still deeply felt. As we move forward, we'll explore how the windmill's legacy is still alive in the modern world, and how its impact continues to shape our understanding of renewable energy. But for now, it's worth reflecting on the windmill's incredible journey. From a simple invention born out of necessity to a symbol of human ingenuity and progress. As we reflect on the decline of the traditional windmill and its eventual replacement by steam engines, it's important to consider the broader societal changes that were unfolding during this time. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about the rise of steam power. It was also about a shift in how people thought about energy, labor, and the environment. With the growth of large-scale manufacturing and urbanization, the need for reliable and constant sources of power became more pressing than ever. And this is where the windmill's legacy really starts to become interesting. You see, while windmills were being gradually replaced by steam engines and, later, electricity, their influence never truly disappeared. In fact, many of the core principles that made windmills such an important part of European society still resonate today in our pursuit of renewable energy. The windmill, in its simplest form, was an early attempt to harness a natural, renewable resource. And that concept is more relevant now than ever. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the world's growing energy demands, coupled with environmental concerns, have led to a renewed interest in wind power. Wind turbines, which are essentially modernized versions of the windmills of old, have become a cornerstone of the global shift toward sustainable energy sources. But this transition didn't happen overnight. It took decades of research, technological development, and even trial and error before wind power could be harnessed efficiently on a large scale. The modern wind turbine is far more efficient and capable than the old windmills, but it owes much of its existence to the fundamental idea of using the wind as a power source. One of the most interesting things about the development of modern wind turbines is how they've evolved from the same basic concept that led to the creation of windmills centuries ago. In fact, many of the first wind turbines were designed with the intention of replicating the functionality of windmills, particularly their ability to generate mechanical power. Early wind turbines were primarily used for pumping water or generating electricity in isolated areas. Over time, as technology improved, these turbines became larger, more powerful, and more efficient. Historians still debate whether the idea of using wind power for energy generation truly began with the windmill, or if it was simply a case of history repeating itself. Some suggest that the concept of harnessing the wind for power goes back even further, to ancient civilizations like the Egyptians. who used sails to catch the wind and propel boats. Others argue that it was the medieval windmill that laid the groundwork for modern wind energy. Regardless of the exact origins, it's clear that wind power has had a long and fascinating journey, one that has spanned millennia and continues to shape our energy future today. But it's not just the evolution of the windmill into the modern wind turbine that deserves attention. It's the environmental implications of this shift. As we become more aware of the environmental impact of fossil fuels, wind power has emerged as one of the cleanest and most sustainable sources of energy available. Unlike coal or oil, wind energy doesn't pollute the air or contribute to climate change. And unlike solar power, wind energy can be generated day or night, as long as the wind is blowing. In fact, wind power has the potential to provide a significant portion of the world's energy needs. And many countries are already investing heavily in wind energy infrastructure to meet their renewable energy goals. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how wind power is continuing to reshape the world today. From massive offshore wind farms to small-scale turbines powering rural communities, wind energy is becoming an increasingly important part of our global energy mix. But before we get to the present, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how far we've come since the first windmill. From its humble beginnings as a simple, accident-born invention, the windmill has evolved into one of the most important technologies for a sustainable future. It's a testament to the power of innovation, necessity, and a little bit of luck. Now that we've seen how the windmill evolved into the modern wind turbine, it's time to explore how this ancient technology is still playing a crucial role in our world today. Wind power is no longer just a quaint relic of history. It's an essential component of the global energy landscape. From large offshore wind farms to small, community-based turbines, wind energy is helping to meet the world's growing demand for sustainable power. It's almost poetic to think that the same natural force, wind, that powered the first windmills centuries ago is still powering the future. The rise of modern wind turbines marks a significant shift in the way we think about energy production. While the old windmills were primarily used to grind grain, pump water, or drain land, today's wind turbines are designed to generate electricity on a much larger scale. These turbines are incredibly efficient, capable of producing hundreds of megawatts of power. A single large offshore wind farm can generate enough electricity to power thousands of homes. In fact, offshore wind farms are becoming a major player in the global energy market, as wind speeds are generally higher and more consistent at sea. Countries like Denmark, the United Kingdom, and China have invested heavily in offshore wind farms, which are quickly becoming one of the most promising sources of renewable energy. Historians still argue whether the early windmills directly influenced the design of modern wind turbines, or whether the concept of wind power evolved independently. But what's undeniable is that the underlying idea is the same: harnessing the power of wind to create energy. Modern turbines are far more efficient than their predecessors, thanks to advances in materials, engineering, and technology. Today's turbines are equipped with advanced sensors, controls, and gear systems that allow them to optimize their energy production depending on wind conditions. The turbine's blades are designed to catch the most wind possible, and they can adjust their angle to maximize efficiency. One of the most fascinating aspects of modern wind turbines is how much they've advanced in terms of size and scale. Early windmills were small, localized machines, often built by hand. But modern turbines can stand over 300 feet tall, with blades that stretch over 150 feet long. These massive structures are able to generate significant amounts of power, making them a key part of the renewable energy grid. In fact, some of the largest wind farms in the world, like the Gansu wind farm in China, can produce enough electricity to power entire regions, reducing the reliance on fossil fuels and helping to combat climate change. It's not just large-scale wind farms that are making a difference. Smaller, decentralized wind turbines are also gaining traction, especially in rural or off-grid areas. In places where connecting to the main electrical grid is impractical or expensive, small wind turbines provide a reliable and sustainable source of power. These turbines are often used to power individual homes, farms, or communities, giving people greater energy independence and reducing their carbon footprint. The growing popularity of wind energy has sparked a global push for greater investment in renewable energy technologies. As countries strive to meet their climate goals and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, wind power is increasingly seen as a key solution. In fact, wind energy is already one of the fastest-growing sources of renewable energy worldwide. And as technology continues to improve, wind turbines are expected to become even more efficient and cost-effective, making them an even more viable option for large-scale energy production. But the story of wind power isn't just about generating electricity. It's also about the broader environmental impact. Unlike fossil fuels, wind energy doesn't pollute the air or contribute to global warming. It's a clean, renewable resource that has the potential to provide power without depleting natural resources. Wind power also has a much lower environmental footprint than other forms of renewable energy, like solar or hydroelectric power, as wind turbines don't require large amounts of water or land to function. In fact, wind farms can coexist with agricultural land or natural habitats, making them an environmentally friendly option for energy production. It's amazing to think that the first windmill, which was essentially a simple contraption designed to harness wind for basic tasks, has evolved into the powerful turbines we see today. From grain grinding to powering entire cities, the windmill's journey is a testament to human ingenuity and the importance of renewable energy. As the world continues to confront the challenges of climate change and resource depletion, wind power offers a glimmer of hope for a more sustainable future. In the next section, we'll explore the growing role of wind energy in the fight against climate change and the potential for wind power to reshape our global energy infrastructure. Windmills may have started as accidental inventions, but they've become central to our efforts to create a cleaner, greener world. Now that we've seen how wind energy is continuing to reshape our energy infrastructure, it's time to explore its critical role in the global fight against climate change. As the world faces an increasing climate crisis, one of the biggest challenges we have is shifting away from fossil fuels, which are the primary drivers of global warming. The burning of coal, oil, and natural gas releases harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which trap heat and cause the planet to warm. This warming leads to rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and a host of other environmental problems. But in the midst of this crisis, wind power offers a solution. Wind energy, as we've already seen, is a clean and renewable source of power. Unlike fossil fuels, wind power doesn't release harmful emissions or contribute to climate change. Wind turbines generate electricity without burning anything, which means they don't produce carbon dioxide, CO2, or other pollutants. And since wind is an abundant and renewable resource, it's an energy source that we won't run out of, unlike coal or oil. In fact, wind energy has the potential to play a huge role in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions and helping to mitigate the effects of climate change. One of the most exciting aspects of wind power is its scalability. Unlike some other renewable energy sources, Wind power can be deployed on a large scale in offshore wind farms or smaller, decentralized systems in rural or off-grid areas. As the technology continues to improve, wind turbines are becoming more efficient, cost-effective, and capable of generating more power. Wind energy is already one of the fastest-growing sources of renewable energy worldwide, and it's expected to continue expanding in the coming decades. In fact, experts predict that wind power could supply as much as 30% of global electricity needs by 2050, playing a key role in the transition to a cleaner, more sustainable energy future. But while wind power has immense potential, it's not without its challenges. One of the biggest obstacles to scaling up wind energy is the variability of wind. The wind doesn't always blow at the same speed or in the same direction, which means that wind turbines can't generate power consistently all the time. However, advances in energy storage and grid management are helping to address this issue. For example, battery storage systems are being developed to store excess wind energy when the wind is strong, so that it can be used later when demand is higher, or when the wind isn't blowing. Additionally, modern grids are becoming more interconnected, allowing energy from wind farms to be distributed more efficiently across large areas, reducing the impact of local variations in wind patterns. Another challenge is the impact that large-scale wind farms can have on local environments. While wind energy is much cleaner than fossil fuels, building wind farms can still have environmental consequences. For example, large offshore wind farms can disrupt marine ecosystems, and land-based wind farms can have an impact on bird populations. However, many of these challenges are being addressed through careful planning and research. Engineers are developing turbine designs that minimize the risk to wildlife, and wind farms are being carefully sited to avoid sensitive areas. Additionally, many governments are implementing policies that promote responsible development of wind energy, ensuring that it's deployed in ways that are both environmentally and economically sustainable. Despite these challenges, the growth of wind power is a hopeful sign for the future of renewable energy. Wind energy offers a sustainable, low-carbon alternative to fossil fuels. And as the technology continues to improve, it will become an increasingly important part of our global energy mix. Governments, businesses, and communities around the world are recognizing the importance of investing in wind energy to reduce carbon emissions and build a more sustainable future. In the next section, we'll explore how the growth of wind power is influencing global energy policy and what role it will play in shaping the future of energy production. The legacy of the windmill, which began with a simple accident, is now fueling the world's efforts to combat climate change. It's incredible to think how far we've come since those first windmills in Persia, and how much further we have to go as we continue to harness the power of the wind. Now that we've discussed the crucial role of wind power in the fight against climate change, let's shift our focus to how wind energy is influencing global energy policy. As the world continues to grapple with the consequences of fossil fuel consumption, rising temperatures, unpredictable weather patterns, and environmental degradation, there's an increasing push for countries to transition to cleaner, more sustainable energy sources. Wind energy is one of the front-runners in this transition, and governments, industries, and global organizations are taking steps to support its growth and integration into the global energy mix. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the increase in government policies and international agreements that promote renewable energy. The Paris Agreement, for example, which was adopted by nearly every nation in 2015, set ambitious targets to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To achieve these targets, Countries have pledged to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels and invest in cleaner energy sources like wind and solar. In fact, many nations have set specific goals for expanding wind power as part of their climate action plans. For instance, the European Union has been a strong advocate for wind energy, recognizing it as a key component of its renewable energy strategy. The EU has set a target to generate 32% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030, with wind power expected to play a central role in achieving that goal. Several EU countries, including Denmark, Germany, and Spain, have already invested heavily in wind energy, and they continue to expand their wind farm capacities. Denmark, in particular, has been a leader in offshore wind energy, with the country setting the goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. On the other side of the globe, China has emerged as a dominant player in the wind energy sector. As the world's largest producer of wind turbines and a major investor in wind power infrastructure, China is accelerating its efforts to reduce its dependence on coal and other polluting energy sources. The Chinese government has set ambitious goals for renewable energy development, including a target of 20% of its energy coming from non-fossil sources by 2025. To meet this goal, China is expanding both onshore and offshore wind farms at an unprecedented rate. In the United States, the transition to wind power has also gained significant momentum. While there has been some political debate over the role of renewable energy in the country's future, many states have taken proactive steps to incorporate wind energy into their energy portfolios. Texas, for example, is the largest producer of wind energy in the country, with wind turbines providing nearly 20% of the state's electricity. Other states, like Iowa and Kansas, are also heavily invested in wind energy, and federal policies like tax incentives for wind projects have helped to accelerate the growth of the industry. One of the key drivers behind these policy shifts is the growing recognition of the economic benefits of wind energy. Wind power is not only good for the environment, but it also has the potential to create jobs and stimulate economic growth. The wind energy industry already supports hundreds of thousands of jobs worldwide, from turbine manufacturing and installation to maintenance and operation. As countries invest in wind energy, they're creating new industries and expanding existing ones, helping to drive economic development while simultaneously reducing their carbon footprint. Despite these successes, however, there are still challenges to overcome. One of the main obstacles is the continued reliance on fossil fuels in many parts of the world. While some countries are making strides toward clean energy, others are still heavily dependent on coal, oil, and natural gas. This is particularly true in emerging economies, where energy demand is growing rapidly. Transitioning to renewable energy in these regions can be difficult, as the infrastructure and capital required for large-scale wind projects may not be readily available. Additionally, as we discussed earlier, the intermittent nature of wind power presents its own challenges. While wind turbines can generate a significant amount of electricity when the wind is blowing, they can also produce little to no power during periods of calm. This issue can be mitigated through energy storage systems or a more interconnected grid. But it's still a factor that must be addressed in the global transition to renewable energy. Despite these challenges, the future of wind energy looks promising. The global push for cleaner, more sustainable energy is gaining momentum, and wind power is set to play an increasingly important role in the world's energy future. As governments, industries, and communities continue to invest in wind energy, the technology will continue to evolve, becoming more efficient cost-effective, and widespread. The legacy of the windmill, which began as a humble tool to harness the wind, is now powering the world's efforts to combat climate change and build a more sustainable future. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how the modern wind energy industry is continuing to innovate, with new technologies and solutions that are helping to make wind power more accessible and efficient. From new turbine designs to breakthroughs in storage and grid management, the future of wind power is bright, and the story of the windmill is far from over. As we continue exploring the ever-evolving world of wind power, it's impossible not to acknowledge the incredible innovations that are driving the wind energy industry forward. While the early windmills were simple devices built to catch the wind and power basic tasks, today's wind turbines are engineering marvels. They're larger, more efficient, and capable of generating much more power than their ancient ancestors could have ever imagined. But what's even more exciting is that the technology is still advancing, with new developments helping to overcome some of the long-standing challenges of wind energy. One of the most significant innovations in recent years has been the development of larger, more powerful wind turbines. Modern turbines are often enormous, with blades that can span over 150 feet, and they stand as tall as a 30-story building. These giant turbines can produce hundreds of megawatts of electricity, making them capable of powering thousands of homes. But it's not just their size that makes them more efficient. It's the improvements in their design and materials. Engineers are continually refining turbine blades to maximize their ability to capture wind energy, using lighter and stronger materials like carbon fiber and advanced composites. One particularly exciting area of innovation is the development of floating wind turbines. Traditional wind turbines are fixed to the seabed, but floating turbines are designed to float in deeper waters, where the wind is stronger and more consistent. This opens up huge potential for offshore wind farms, as many of the best locations for wind energy are in deep water, far from shore. Floating wind turbines could revolutionize the offshore wind industry, allowing countries to harness the full potential of wind power without being limited by the depth of the ocean. Another breakthrough in wind energy technology is the development of vertical axis wind turbines, VAWTs, which differ from the traditional horizontal axis designs most people are familiar with. While horizontal axis turbines have blades that rotate like the blades of a windmill, vertical axis turbines have blades that spin around a central vertical shaft. VAWTs offer several advantages, including the ability to operate in turbulent wind conditions and a smaller footprint. They're also more versatile in urban environments, where space is limited, and they're quieter than their horizontal counterparts. While VAWTs are still less common than horizontal axis turbines, they are an exciting area of research and development in the wind energy sector. Perhaps the most important innovation, however, is in the area of energy storage and grid management. As we discussed earlier, one of the main challenges of wind power is its intermittent nature. The wind doesn't blow all the time, and it can be unpredictable, meaning wind turbines can't always generate electricity when it's needed. To address this, new energy storage solutions are being developed that can store excess energy generated by wind turbines and release it when demand is high or when the wind isn't blowing. Technologies like large-scale batteries, pumped hydro storage, and even compressed air energy storage are being explored as ways to store wind energy for later use. These advances are helping to make wind energy a more reliable and consistent source of power. In addition to storage, improvements in grid technology are also playing a critical role in the integration of wind power into the global energy system. Smart grids, which use advanced sensors and software to manage the flow of electricity, are making it easier to incorporate renewable energy sources like wind and solar into the grid. These grids can adjust the flow of electricity in real time, making sure that power from wind turbines is distributed efficiently and reliably to where it's needed. This is essential as we transition to a cleaner energy future, where wind and other renewables will play an increasingly important role in meeting the world's energy needs. The rise of digital technologies is also playing a role in the wind energy revolution. From predictive maintenance to real-time monitoring, new software and sensors are helping wind turbine operators optimize performance and reduce downtime. Predictive analytics, for example, can forecast when a turbine is likely to need maintenance, allowing for proactive repairs that prevent costly breakdowns. This level of precision and efficiency wasn't possible in the early days of wind power, and it's helping to make wind energy a more cost-effective option. All of these innovations are helping to make wind power more accessible, affordable, and efficient. But perhaps most importantly, they are helping to solidify wind energy's place as a cornerstone of the global transition to renewable energy. The story of windmills, which began as a simple tool to harness wind for basic tasks, has come full circle. The windmill has evolved into the modern wind turbine, a key player in the fight against climate change and the search for sustainable energy solutions. In the next section, we'll wrap up our journey through the history of windmills and wind power, reflecting on the incredible impact they've had on human civilization and the role they will continue to play in the future of energy production. The legacy of the windmill is far from over. It's now powering the world's efforts to create a cleaner, greener future for generations to come. As we near the end of our journey, it's incredible to reflect on how far we've come from the first accidental invention of the windmill. What began as a simple, rudimentary tool in ancient Persia to harness the wind for basic tasks has evolved into one of the most powerful forces driving the global shift toward renewable energy. The windmill, in its many forms, has shaped economies, industries, and entire regions. And now, the legacy of that ancient innovation is helping to combat climate change and power the world with clean, sustainable energy. Looking back at the history of windmills, it's clear that they've been much more than just a tool for harnessing wind. They've been symbols of human ingenuity, creativity, and resilience. The ancient windmills, with their clunky blades and trial-and-error designs, may have seemed primitive, but they were the foundation for the energy systems that would power entire civilizations. In places like the Netherlands, windmills helped transform marshy land into fertile farmland and became integral to the growth of industries like milling, sawmilling, and water management. They weren't just tools for survival. They were symbols of human innovation at its best. As windmill technology spread through Europe, its influence grew, and the machines evolved. By the time they reached their full potential, windmills were transforming landscapes, shaping economies, and changing the way people worked and lived. The Dutch, in particular, mastered the art of windmill construction, and their wind-powered systems became models of efficiency that influenced industrial development across the continent. But it wasn't just about making life easier. It was about creating the foundation for future growth. Windmills were a key part of the agricultural and industrial revolutions, providing the power needed to sustain growing populations and economies. But, as we know, no technology remains static forever. As industrialization continued, the windmill began to fade in favor of newer, more reliable technologies. The rise of steam engines, electricity, and other forms of energy rendered the traditional windmill obsolete. And yet, Even as windmills became relics of the past, they weren't completely forgotten. The principles behind wind power lived on, eventually giving birth to modern wind turbines, sleek, powerful machines that are once again harnessing the wind to generate electricity for the world. Today, wind turbines are at the forefront of the global push for clean, renewable energy. Wind power has become one of the fastest-growing energy sources worldwide, and its role in reducing carbon emissions and mitigating climate change cannot be overstated. Wind farms, both onshore and offshore, are helping to power homes, businesses, and entire cities with clean, sustainable energy. Advances in turbine design, energy storage, and grid management are making wind power more efficient and cost-effective than ever before. And with the rise of floating wind turbines and vertical axis designs, the future of wind energy looks even brighter. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the windmill is how it has shaped our approach to energy. The ancient windmill, born out of necessity and driven by the desire for innovation, was the first step in humanity's long journey toward harnessing natural forces for power. And now, as we face the challenges of climate change and resource depletion, wind power is once again providing a solution. The windmill, which once seemed like a humble tool of survival, has become a symbol of hope and progress in the fight for a sustainable future. As we close out our exploration of the history of windmills and wind power, it's important to remember that the journey is far from over. We've only scratched the surface of the potential that wind energy holds for our future. With continued innovation and investment, wind power has the capacity to meet a significant portion of the world's energy needs, reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and help preserve our planet for future generations. So, the next time you see a wind turbine spinning gracefully on the horizon, take a moment to appreciate the journey that brought it there. From the ancient windmills of Persia to the massive wind farms of today, the story of wind power is one of perseverance, creativity, and human ingenuity. And as the windmills of the past fade into history, their legacy will continue to shape the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. It looks like we've reached the end of the script. I hope you enjoyed the journey through the history of windmills and wind power. From their humble beginnings in ancient Persia to their role in shaping modern renewable energy solutions, the windmill's legacy is both fascinating and inspiring. As we conclude, remember the incredible transformations powered by these simple yet ingenious machines, from millennia ago to the powerful turbines we rely on today. The evolution of wind power is truly a testament to the creativity and perseverance of human innovation. Now, as the wind hums gently in the distance, let it carry you into a peaceful sleep. As we reflect on the power of nature and our ongoing journey toward a sustainable future. Sweet dreams.